The truth is, I've never been less optimistic about the current state of the UK economy and its future. So in this video, I wanted to go through the updated forecasts for the economy, some of the policies that were announced, and the last thing I'm going to cover is my freewheeling opinions about why it is I'm so pessimistic about the state of the UK economy. We'll start with growth for the time being. Now, Rachel Reeves tells us that, quote, the world has changed since her last budget. And that really is the driving factor behind all these cuts, all these downgrades, all these benefit cuts. And the truth is, we're going to dig into that a little bit later because, as you might imagine, it's not entirely accurate. But having said that, the OBR does acknowledge this, saying, quote, against this more challenging and uncertain backdrop, we expect real GDP growth of around 1% this year, half the rate in our October forecast before it recovers to an average of around 1.75% over the rest of the decade. Basically, the OBR had expected the UK economy to grow by about 2% this year. They've now cut that in half to 1% for the rest of the year. In yellow, you can see the forecast that they made back in October, and the March forecast you can see in blue. But this is where they start to lose me a little bit, because these are forecasts that they made 6 months ago that they're backpedaling on, cutting their forecasted growth rate for the economy in half in the space of 6 months. So it really makes me question how reliable their forecasts are going to be in the next 5 years. But the main reason really why they forecasted higher growth into next year is because of some of the house building targets. And they've acknowledged this, saying here, quote, while the government's planning reforms deliver a modest boost to the level of potential output by 0.2% in 2029, its cumulative growth between 2023 and 2029 is still half a percentage point lower than we projected in October, and the level of productivity is over 1% lower. And they've kind of acknowledged it here in this graph. Take a look. So the dotted line shows the March 2025 before the new measures were announced, and then the solid line shows after these new measures were announced. And you can see there's a pretty sizable jump up to. So next we're going to move on to inflation. Now, inflation, unfortunately, is forecasted to increase this year. The OBR says, quote, inflation is forecast to average 3.2% this year, up from 2.6% previously forecasted, before falling back to 2.1% in 2026 and then hitting the government's 2% target in 2027. So, unfortunately, this is more bad news. There was plenty of speculation that the worst of inflation was going to be behind us, and whilst it does seem unlikely we're going to hit double digits as we did towards the second half of 2022, inflation is going to be stickier for longer and above the 2% target. But just take a look at this graph. We can see here in yellow the October 2024 forecast, and then in the darker blue line we've got the March 2025 forecast. So you can see this slight blip upwards in 2025. But the OBR does also acknowledge that one of the primary drivers here is the increase in employers' national insurance contributions. The maths on this one, frankly, is kind of simple. The government has increased national insurance contributions for employers. They have a bigger wage bill, and in order to cover that, they pass it on to their customers. And that's really the calculation. So with inflation forecasted to stay higher for longer, what does that mean for interest rates is, I think, the next obvious question. And the OBR covers that in the report too, saying, quote, interest rate expectations have risen since our October forecast. The bank rate is expected to fall from its current level of 4.5% to 3.8% from mid-2026 onwards. And the truth is, it wasn't that long ago that the forecasts were going to be the bank rate would be 3.5% by the end of this year, not 3.8% by the middle of next year. And so what that basically means is that mortgage holders are unlikely to get the interest rate reprieve that they'd maybe hoped for throughout the rest of the year. Next, we're going to move on to productivity. Now, you don't have to have been around this channel for too long to know that productivity is kind of one of my pet projects, one of the things I really like to keep an eye on. Because in my view, it is one of the core and fundamental problems facing the economy. And here, I'll put this graph on screen, which I always show when we're talking about productivity. You can see the pink line here shows the average productivity growth rate from 1990 to 2007, and the blue line shows the actual productivity growth rate. And as you can see, it's just completely flatlined. It's gone almost nowhere since the financial crisis. And it gets worse after the Brexit referendum in 2016. And I'm also afraid to say that when you make international comparisons, the picture does kind of get even bleaker. Take a look here. This is the UK versus the OECD. You can see the UK in blue and the OECD in this pinkish colour. And again, the UK is well behind and falling behind. But there is some good news here. The OBR has increased its productivity forecast for the year, saying, quote, the outlook for productivity growth, one of the most important forecast judgments, is uncertain both in terms of its level and growth rate. Trend productivity growth averages 1% a year in our central forecast. If the recent weakness in trend productivity growth persists and the growth averages just 0.3% a year, the current budget will be in deficit by 1.4% of GDP in 2029 and 2030. If the recent weakness proves to be entirely cyclical and so trend growth in output per hour averages 1.2% a year, then the current budget will be in surplus by 0.9% of GDP in 2029 and 2030. And this might be one of the primary reasons why I'm so pessimistic about the UK economy, is that it's when you read passages like that that you realise even when there is some good news in these forecasts and in these reports and in all these calculations that they're doing, the margin of error is so unbelievably narrow. It's really riding on a knife edge. And on this very morning, as I'm recording this, Donald Trump has just announced tariffs on all cars and all car parts entering into the US, a 25% tariff. When you have those levels of uncertainty, it just seems as though you can't take these razor-thin margins for granted. Let's move on to the policies that were actually announced. Firstly, housing. The OBR has estimated changes to England's planning system announced last year will boost house building by 170,000 over 5 years. The changes are forecast to grow the size of the economy by 0.2% by 2030 and 0.4% by 2035. So that's the increase in house building that we mentioned in this graph just here a few minutes ago. So it's all related. Next is defence and overseas aid. Defence spending, which had been due to rise £2.9 billion next year, to increase by a further £2.2 billion. The Treasury says this will make the military expenditure 2.36% of national income next year, and a, quote, down payment on plans to raise it to 2.5% by 2027. Now, this has basically been paid for by cutting the budget for overseas aid from 0.5% to 0.3%. Next, we have public services. Day-to-day government spending is to fall by $6.1 billion per year by 2030, growing by 1.2% in real terms after taking account for inflation after 2026, instead of 1.3%. But we should really get into some of the big announcements, which were some of the changes around benefits. So if you claim PIP or personal independent payment and do not qualify when the criteria are tightened, you are likely to be hardest hit. Some 370,000 people are expected to lose their entitlement altogether, and others will receive less than what they expect. The average loss is £4,500 a year. And if you're on universal credit, then you could benefit. A total of 3.8 million current and future claimants will be £420 a year better off on average by 2029 to 2030. After taking account of the impact for inflation. And they have also increased the allowance for universal credit. The government has said that this will raise the standard allowance for universal credit for 6.5 million people. It will now rise to £106 a week for a single claimant over the age of 2025. By the government's own estimates, cuts to welfare mean 250,000 more people, including 50,000 children, will be pushed into poverty by 2030. The government's assessment predicts. And so the government knows that this is going to have a detrimental effect on some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society. And I think the thing that I find most annoying about all of this is that there's plenty of analysis out there from independent think tanks and so on, which have even said that the government is going to have to raise taxes anyway, breaking the initial commitment that was in their manifesto. Paul Dale, chief economist at Capital Economics, said, non-defence spending can only be cut so far, and the UK's uncomfortable concoction of low economic growth and high interest rates mean public borrowing can only rise so far. The inevitable conclusion is that at some point, the government may have to break its election promises and raise taxes for households. The full budget later this year will be the next flashpoint. And he's not the only one. Paul Johnson, who's the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has a similar assessment, saying that the budget, quote, leaves you at the mercy of events. So now we're just going to move on to my thoughts, and this is really where I'm going to be shooting from the hip, and I'm going to let loose a little bit more. It seems that no matter what kind of video I do or how balanced I think I'm being, in the comments I'm referred to as a Tory plant or I'm on the payroll of Labour, so, you know, whatever. Now I think we should really acknowledge two things. The first is that anyone who tries to tell you otherwise, that Labour inherited a bad economy. Anyone who tries to not even concede that point, I think people were tired of the way the Conservatives had handled the economy. So Labour were dealt a raw hand. There's no two ways about it. But they've handled it so badly since then. Now, we should also be clear that the Conservatives were very cynical. By cutting national insurance contributions twice in the run-up to the general election, they'd hoped to either buy voters or to absolutely torpedo any fiscal headroom that Labour might have inherited. Each of those tax cuts were unfunded and cost the Treasury about £10 billion each. So that's £20 billion per year of headroom that they just decided to wipe out in an election that, frankly, they knew they were going to lose. So let's just, let's be real about this here. And then I think the second thing that we really need to consider is when you've got someone as erratic as Donald Trump, who is making all sorts of tariffs, no tariffs, tariffs on you but not on you, and then they get cancelled, that is invariably going to have a global economic impact. The saying that you hear all the time in economics is, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. But here's where I think Labour have gone really wrong. They've painted themselves into a corner by saying that they weren't going to increase national insurance, income tax, VAT. They basically take about 3/4 of the UK's total tax take completely off the table, and immediately it limits their options. But the thing I find really frustrating is, no matter what your particular brand of political vodka, whether you think it's increasing taxes to offer better public services or cutting taxes to put more money in people's pockets, it almost doesn't matter. They just seem to have no ambition about engaging with the problems in a meaningful way. And the other thing is that some of these problems just require cash. There's no efficiency savings, there's getting consultants in, there's no reorganisation or any of that. Some things just need money to be fixed. But I think the other thing that makes me even more pessimistic is that they're not even meaningfully engaging in some of the current problems that the system has that wouldn't go near any of their manifesto promises. We talked in another video about some of the ways that they could really fix the tax system. Take council tax, for example. Burnley is one of the most deprived areas in the country, and the average council tax is about 1.1% of the average house value in Burnley. If you go to somewhere like Westminster or central London, it's 0.1%. And that means that the poorest people are paying the most for their council tax. That is just insane. And I recently found out that I pay more in council tax than Buckingham Palace. I mean, as long as we have a system that facilitates things like that, and it doesn't matter, this is not necessarily a left or right issue. This is that is fucking bananas issue. When Buckingham Palace's council tax bill is about 1,800 quid a year, that is really shit. Just completely equalise council tax 0.5% for absolutely everyone. That means that people who are in less well-off areas get a tax cut. People who are in more well-off areas have to pay a bit more. And if you're living in a £150 million penthouse on One Hyde Park, you can afford it. Let's be real. We should also point out that when the UK could borrow very, very, very cheaply when interest rates were low, the Conservatives elected not to invest in some of the critical infrastructure all around the UK. We could have had it all for, the sorts of rates which, frankly, we probably will never see again. We could have had better internet, we could have had better public transport, we could have had better public services. The Conservatives at the time could have taken advantage of low interest rates, locked those in, and really used it as an opportunity to modernise the economy. And they just didn't. And I think that, for me, that really is a real crime. But this is really, I think, the source of why I'm so pessimistic about the state of the economy, is that even the stuff that is just, for the most part, I would say non-partisan, things that just are not working, that they could do something with, but are just choosing not to. And if they can't engage in, I think, what would be potentially incremental improvements that don't cost a whole lot of money, like sorting out council tax or sorting out VAT to make that less complicated, if they're not really willing to engage with some of those problems, because as I mentioned in the last video, normally when you look at an economy, you can see some bits are doing well, some bits are doing not so well, but you get a reasonable view about where you think are going to be the strengths of the economy. The real concern I have is that there seem to be no green shoots for meaningful growth for the economy. And that's the real concern for me, I must say. Now, look, I like to think that this channel, we focus on economics rather than politics, but I also admit it can be difficult to try and separate the two, but we do the best we can here. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for indulging in my ranting and ravings, but never mind. As I say, this is not normally the sort of video that we would do on this channel. We have a whole host of videos covering all sorts of these topics, how they can fix the tax system, why the UK tax system stops you building wealth. I'll put links for some of the videos in the description. We've got about half a dozen. And if you really want to level up your understanding, I would really recommend you check them out. Thanks very much for putting up with me. Thanks very much for watching.